Welcome to Am I Cynic, the podcast with a license to inform. This is your host, Thomas Brancato. Today, George and I are joined by Mr. Ahmed Patel. Ahmed, it's great to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So Ahmed's education and work is in Muslim extremism, and he's been a specialist in terrorist insight, focusing on British European cases in a freelance capacity since 1988. That's more than 34 years. Mm-hmm. And Ahmed has been featured in numerous different articles, publishings, media, shorts, YouTube. Ahmed is a respected voice within the terrorism research community, counterterrorism. And it's an honor to have you here with us today, Ahmed, to speak about these issues.
Well, thank you very much once again.
So I wanted to start with perhaps what is the most often questions that is directed towards you, because you have an interesting sort of journey into counterterrorism and terrorism extremism research. Mm-hmm. And that is that as we commemorate 17 years since the terrorist bombings in London on the 7th of July of 2005, in which 4 separate bombs were detonated that day, which saw 52 people lose their lives, in a day marked by carnage, violence, hatred, in short, terrorism. But for yourself, that day took on an exceptional pain, as you were told only days later that your brother-in-law, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, died as one of the suicide bombers responsible for the attacks that day. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us a little about how you managed that shocking revelation and how it affected your life and your work and your research since?
Well, initially on the morning of the 12th of July, 2005, I had a knock on the door. Must have been about 6:30 a.m. And I saw, obviously, these men in suits along with my family. And I was half asleep, so I asked them what's going on. So my brother just moved a bit forward and said, that thing in London, Siddiq's done it. So this is something that really shocks a lot of people. And then obviously the counterterrorism officers were there. And I asked them, I goes, who are you? And they identified themselves as Scotland Yard, British counterterrorism, etc. So then I turned around and I asked them, I was, what's happening? What's going on? And then, once again, my brother said that thing in London. And I said, what thing in London? Because with it being summer, July, you hardly ever switch the TV on. So I wasn't even aware of anything in London, apart from, I think, an early morning news story about some electrical problem. And after that, the TV was off for 5-6 days. So then, as the officers came in, I switched the TV on. Once again, I asked the officers what's going on? Who are you? What's going on? And they showed us their cards and everything. So it was just an absolute shock. And then even as the news unfolded during the day, there was denial and confusion, and just looking at everything, hang on, there's been a mistake here somewhere. First of all, these kind of things, bombings, don't happen. I know about the IRA, but you think, hang on. And then because of my brother-in-law having shown no signs, I actually thought, okay, if somebody has done a bombing, right, then he's a victim. He hasn't done it. He might have been on the train, but he's just one of the victims. So, and once again, I do get questioned, and people will say things like to me, like, you're lying, you're making this up. I goes, listen, the counterterrorism officers were there. They were present in my living room. I was asking them, and they were aware of my reaction. So, I don't have anything to worry about, because I do get sometimes nasty comments. And recently I've been back on Twitter and talking to people, and I do get accusations thrown at me. Well, the counterterrorism officers, they were there on the 12th of July. They had to tell me what happened.
Yes, quite an unusual turn of events. I'm sure if, as you say, you're not a TV or a media consumer. But I guess one of the questions that must be often directed towards you Ahmed, and one that I'd like to as well, to just to have a better idea of the events that took place thereafter. Is of course, were you aware of any signs or any indications that Muhammad and Siddiq Khan was thinking this way and feeling this way and was imminently about to strike?
No, because his lifestyle was, he was still a loner. He was married to my sister, but he was still a loner. So we would get into arguments about, where are you half the time? Because he was hardly ever at home. And and to some extent, I just thought maybe he has a girlfriend somewhere or a second wife somewhere. He was always traveling. So he was basically like I actually thought that when he became a father, he'd be more at home, but this never happened. He was hardly ever at home. And the thing with Dewsbury, Dewsbury being a Sufi community, he didn't like Dewsbury. He didn't pray in any of the mosques in Dewsbury as a Salafi. And he even told me that I don't believe my prayers are going to be answered in any of these mosques in Dewsbury. So I said, well, why did you marry my sister then? Why did you come here? What's your problem? So I had a lot of conflict with him. A lot of conflict. Some people, if they ask me, I reveal it, and some people, they don't ask me, I don't reveal it. But I had a lot of conflict with him. But in terms of the extremism side, there was nothing. It was just, I don't know, maybe he didn't want to attract attention to himself. Maybe he knew my mindset, which is Sufi mindset. So maybe if he did reveal something to me, he would have thought, maybe Ahmad will go to the police. So there was nothing. It was just normal conversation, just normal. Okay, he talked about Iraq, but everybody talked about Iraq. The entire country, the world talked about the Iraq invasion, and that was it. Nothing to be worried about.
Right. One of the things that we would assume on the outside is that somebody that's capable of this much violence and carnage and planning, would be at any opportunity would very vociferous about their hatred of this and that. But as you're saying, it's not always the case. No. That is very visible and obvious. And we'll mention this further down in the conversation, but online communities and the internet in general has provided a meeting ground where one can exchange hateful ideologies with other people in almost complete anonymity and silence. I'm not sure if this was the case for Siddiq. But it just goes to show how Siddiq could have had this family life and this public life that wouldn't have raised any suspicions, unfortunately, until it was too late. Do you think that's true?
Well, as I say to many people, that most of what I know about him now is obviously after the 12th of July. From online research, and there's an interview with his own oldest brother, and then revelations were made, which came out, I think, about 1 or 2 years after, regarding something called Operation Crevice. So everything, the information I have now is really about his life and his input from official sources, government sources, and revelations, which I found shocking as well. And I know of the word that was used initially was clean skins, but then it came out that, once again, referring to Operation Crevice, people can go online and research that. But yeah, I would say that he obviously wanted to, as far as family or ourselves or locally, he wanted to remain under the radar. So there was nothing suspicious here. But then revelations online about what some people knew out there, I still find them shocking to this day.
Muhammad Siddiq Khan, he produced a video before his suicide bombing in which he mentioned British foreign policy as the motive of his actions. And of course, he was not the only one to list foreign policy as a direct motivation. There were many others before him, many other terrorists who also saw foreign policy as the prime motivator of their attacks. Do you see a correlation between Western intervention? Then we're talking 2005, as you've mentioned, still in the middle of the Iraq war. In fact, during a year in which it was particularly bloody, 2005, with many bombs going off in Baghdad, shootings and personnel lost for the coalition forces, and of course Iraqi civilians. But do you see a correlation between that Western intervention in places like Iraq, but also perhaps Libya, not to mention many other more, and terror attacks at home? And how much do you think we can attribute to the politics or the political fallback from that intervention, rather than, let's say, other motivations such as, and we'll get into this perhaps later, but perhaps mental health problems, broadly speaking? You know, if there was a balance between the motivations, do you think foreign policy outcry would be on top?
Well, I mean, the whole foreign policy debate, and I try to, and I've, the grievance factor, people, we do accept millions of lives have been lost in these countries. And I mean, the phrasing that I use is these, even some of activists and the terrorists will use those as justifications or soft justifications. Like when I'm discussing terrorism with Muslims who don't support obviously terrorism, but they say, well, what about? So because I am a Sufi Muslim, my mindset is, forget the what about, because as a Sufi Muslim, we focus on ourselves and our community and our connection to God. Whereas politicized Muslims, obviously with the legal activism, they might mention foreign policy grievance. And we know it has obviously caused problems. I can't take away the pain on the reality of what has happened to millions of people abroad, right? Because they have suffered, and millions of innocent people have suffered, and that has happened. And it's not for me to negate what has happened to them. But when some terrorists, they use that justifier, and then with regards to my brother-in-law, I thought, hang on. Because then at some time in my mind, something clicked in me when I was researching white mass shooters in America, because I've done a lot of research. There's a whole list of books. And at one particular point, I can't remember, this is before I went public, I was thinking, hang on, why is it that whenever a white mass shooter in America does something, and there's been a huge amount this year, one of the first things that people do is they try to approach the family and they start discussing mental health issues. And yet when a Muslim does something, the first thing or the questions go to the community. Let's go talk to the imam. Let's go talk to the local mosque. Is it Islam? Is it Muslims? Is it the Prophet? So after observing this for many years, I then decided to make public a certain revelation. This revelation, before I actually did my first interview, I emailed to a lot of researchers. And the revelation is that he was a victim of an incident with an imam in a mosque around about the age of 10. He went home, he told his parents. Now, I've explained this in more detail as a Barelvi, that he comes from a Barelvi background. In the Barelvi background, the imam is more than an imam, is much more than an imam. So he goes home and he says to his parents and family, I've been abused. His parents didn't want to know. The family didn't want to know. Now, this revelation, when he made to be in my living room, I was absolutely shocked. And I had to then, when I discussed the book with Dr. Lewis Herrington, Understanding Islam Terrorism in Europe, he then explained to me the effect of child abuse, that child abuse, someone carries this for life, and at sometimes they need to unload, and it's to do with shame and remorse and things like that. So this connection with abuse, childhood abuse, trauma, few people have either been, been able to communicate this to the public. It's very easy to always just say it's Islam because it's a Muslim, but via my discussions with Dr. Lewis Herrington, and when I read I was given the chapters of his book, obviously, and I'm an acknowledged contributor. I then came across someone who understood, but who was able to articulate, this particular mindset or, this reaction to the abuse. And like I say, it's best left to him because, I'm not a professor, so I'm not that fantastic at communicating. But that's why when I've connected to him, I found that he explained childhood trauma and the effect it has. Now, a lot of people, they will say, and once again, I've got this on Twitter. So you're saying that terrorists are terrorists because of childhood trauma, because of childhood abuse. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying that these are factors, and the desire to be a hero, the desire to be a man, the desire to prove yourself is now also acknowledged by many other professors that I can send you links to. But this is something that I always knew, and I had in the back of my mind, is that, if it's a Muslim terrorist, Islam, it's a white mass shooter, then it's mental health. And I found that very problematic and unfair.
You're onto something here, and I think the media landscape is certainly the one chiefly to blame. As you said, if it's a white person who commits a heinous act, it's a mass shooting. If it's a Muslim person, it's terrorism, Islamic terrorism. And certainly there's much more to talk about there. But just going off your mention of Lewis Herrington, I've got in front of me a table penned by Lewis Herrington, Drugs, Jihad and the Pursuit of Martyrdom, in which there's a column by which it's terrorist attacks dating from the first item being the 25th of May 2013, and the last one the 30th of May of 2018. So 5 years worth of terrorist attacks in Europe. And you can see, for example, 20th of December 2014, the Tours police station attack, and it lists the addiction, the psychopathy of the chief attacker in question. So, for example, on that attack, you have cannabis. But if you look, for example, at the Nice truck attack in France, 14th of July 2016, we have cocaine addiction and a history of mental instability. Or in Italy, on the 19th of May of 2017, the Milan station stabbing, another cocaine addiction and diminished responsibility. So it seems that Lewis Herrington, and if I'm not mistaken yourself, Ahmed, is making a connection between terrorist attackers and a history of criminality, a history of drug addiction, a history of psychopathology, and perhaps a bit more difficult to evidence, a history of child abuse. Do you think there's a correlation there that is not often talked about?
Well, I mean, if you just forgive me, I have a book here, Jihad and Death, The Global Appeal of Islamic State, Olivier Roy. Once again, he states quite clearly, majority of terrorists in Europe were all petty criminals. So, I have a whole library of research. And then another book I've just pulled out, Brigadier Barker, The Dark Trajectory of Jihad. He calls most of the people who went to join ISIS losers who had nothing better to do. No jobs, no life, no family. Ex-criminals who wanted to prove something. So it's not just me, and it's not just now Dr. Lewis Herrington. There's also Olivier Roy and Brigadier Barker, who's actually ex-FBI.
The question, though, that comes up with, when you're discussing ISIS in particular is, well, there's two questions that come to mind, which is, first, is this comparison with the white and nationalist problem? And so it begs the question of, is the process of radicalization different for Muslim extremists than it is for white mass shooters? The other question that springs to mind off the back of this then is basically, why does it happen with the frequency it does? There was a statistic that I thought was quite shocking at the time when ISIS was conquering in Iraq and Syria, which was that more British Muslims were fighting in ISIS than were enlisted in the British military.
Well, obviously now moving on from the issue of drugs and personal issues, there is the other issue of ideology. So I'm not going to negate ideology completely. Ideology is also a factor. So there are also some Muslims who will 100% think that terrorism is the right thing to do. So once again, as with many other issues, you have to accept a spectrum of ideology or a spectrum of belief where you have a combination of grievance and you have a combination of ideology. And it's quite possible that there are some people who don't have any grievance and who have perfectly, decent lives, but their ideology, somewhere along the line, they say, okay, it's quite fine to do all this. And this is kind of ties into my work also on child sexual abuse, where some people think that it's okay to rape a Yazidi because I'm a Muslim and she's not a Muslim. So I'm not a denier. I'm not going to say that it's all that they are victims or they are, we should feel sorry for them because they were abused as children or they were drug addicts. There are, they do make a choice. And this is something that confuses people. And I say, hang on, I haven't finished the conversation yet, because we're having a conversation. People do make a choice. And sometimes there are those out there of a particular persuasion, they will use the term grooming, they were groomed, specifically talking about, some girls from London. Well, sometimes people do make a choice. And that's the part where also the tough part of the equation, that we have to accept that, yeah, they do make a choice. They're not, they've made a rational choice that, what I'm doing is right.
And I think that the tough part is a really interesting point, because, you can be a victim and a perpetrator at the same time.
Yeah.
This is when life gets a bit more complicated than some people on the left, and especially, if you don't mind me saying so, a lot of young people today who want to make everything so black and white.
Yeah.
There are victims and perpetrators. There's no doubt that in the case of, for example, your former brother-in-law, Sadiq Khan, there was a history of being a victim, but also that he shoulders the majority of the blame for being a perpetrator and not seeking the difficult, long, arduous process that is healing oneself through therapy, through friendship, family, community, purpose, job, religion, even in a peaceful conflict. There are so many ways. But unfortunately for himself and for the victims that day, Sadiq Khan chose another option. But in that process, I dare say he was not alone. He was radicalized at some point. We may never know by whom or where exactly, whether it was online based, whether it was by a rogue imam, whether it was by books, whether there's many different pathways to radicalization.
Of course.
But one thing that, and a question that I have for you, Ahmed, is that it seems to me that selling jihad by agents that want to radicalize because they have a political agenda, they may not be the ones who personally strap on a suicide bomb, but they might find younger men, essentially, who have a grievance, whether that is from a personal story of, for example, mental health, drug addiction, child abuse, or are gullible in some other way, vulnerable people, and turn them into perpetrators. And it's these people, the radicalizers, if you will. Do you think that for them, with this motive, it's easier to sell jihad, which promises an instant solution to life's problems, to these dispossessed, gullible youth, rather than the moderate, normal Islam that, and if I might quote you, Ahmed, from our conversation before this podcast, can sometimes be quite dull, repetitive, very conservative, and not so easy to sell, let's say.
Absolutely, just boring, really. I mean, once again, this actually also applies to a lot of converts. And, I've had conversations with other experts talking about converts. Dr. Simon Cotty, he's talked about converts, and I've made a post on LinkedIn about converts. Islam is boring. I will say Islam is boring. There's nothing much exciting about it. You do your prayers, you do your fasting, which is hard. You live a good life. You go through the daily grind with people, and that's about it. So part of the removal of this monotony, along came activism. So now you had these activists who could go on marches, and then you print leaflets, and you have speakers, and there's a lot of ego involved there as well. So you had activism to remove this monotony. And then unfortunately we now have terrorism to take it to another level, gun theft, auto jihad, as I call it, guns and 4x4s and everything, that as we saw with ISIS. So a lot of it is escapism, and a lot of it is choice. And we can't deny the choices people make.
2 Salafi Muslims were shot dead outside a mosque in a Faisalabad district of Punjab province. This is in Pakistan, following a religious divide between the Barelvi and Salafi groups that started about 4 years ago over the construction of the Abu Ayyub Ansari Mosque, which belongs to the Salafi group. Are Muslims targets for Islamic terrorists, or is the problem sort of more, mental health, religion, impulsivity, and ignorance, all of these all combined together?
Well, here you see this has shocked a lot of people. 2 Salafi Muslims shot dead for blaspheming. So we have we have really, I keep telling people it's a power struggle, and it's a power struggle within Islam itself. Now, ISIS are classed as Khawarij in the Arabic terminology. So Khawarij first came about, once again, I believe, because when the whole terrorism discussion started, there was an overuse of the word Salafis. Everybody was using the word Salafis, or it's Salafi. So there are books on Salafism, which, a lot of them should be thrown in the bin. And a lot of, and I say to people, and they don't like it, a lot of so-called expert papers should be thrown in the bin. Because here you have Barelvis killed by Salafis. So there is a lot of the problem, and this is why the Sufism is the opposite of Takfiri, Salafis, or terrorism, is because of the power struggle. Sufis, like myself, we want to focus on ourselves and our communities. And the others, whether you call them Takfiris or whatever, they want to change the world. Now, this particular incident just shows the schism, as I call it, the fault line within Islam. Barelvis wanted to kill Salafis, Salafis wanted to kill Barelvis. Each making the decision that the other is the wrong type of Muslim.
Within this power struggle, this dichotomy, these fault lines, as you were mentioning, Ahmed, between different Islamic sects, do you see that social media and online communities are playing a role in fostering and extending these divisions between the groups? And do you think they're more dangerous than traditional pathways to radicalize, or what we've seen before in history? Is the process now quicker and more aggressive and more severe the more that young people turn towards online social media?
I think for Muslims, we've never really needed social media to, as I say, rip ourselves apart. Because when I go online and look at some of the talks on YouTube coming from the different Muslim sects, it's stuff that has been happening privately over there within mosques for years and within communities. But I think with online, it's just more out there, and it's revealed and it's open. And then people from different countries get involved. This is why I actually publicly call for a complete separation for British Muslims to separate completely from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Saudi. I call for a completely British Islam, because why are British Muslims, still following, people back from India and Pakistan, which we have no connection to? But that's my thinking. But unfortunately, the internet is still allowing this communication. And this constant referral to back home, and I do have arguments with scholars who refer to either back home, India, Pakistan scholars. I say, well, hang on, that's the past, and that's over there. Why do you need their guidance, or why do you have to follow what they're saying? So I do personally call for a complete separation. But you can nobody can tell anybody what to do nowadays. The internet is there; they can click on what they want, they can read what they want, they can follow what they want. But the problem, once again, if it's Muslims that are doing it, it's Islam. But I have to make people aware that we have problems within Islam. Not just within Islam as in within Islam Muslims, but within Islam sects as well, and the different types of thinking within Islam.
Within towns and villages, the problem is widespread. Christianity also had this problem, as I'm sure did many other religions, of intersectionality, a hatred within the sects, war and death. I mean, look at the European history, the 30 Years' War, and the process of the Reformation was extremely bloody. And even in our country, up until recently, discrimination and even outright hatred for Catholicism and legal bans on what Catholics could do as far as government jobs and such and other things was quite present. And further back in history, you could have repression and death penalties handed out for Catholic priests and such. Mm-hmm. So there's a long history of, let's say, violence, even within the religious groups that see each other as blasphemous or heretical. And so in that way, I think that there is an established pathway, an established history of this. And I also agree with you, Ahmed. I think the internet and social media is often seen as a game changer, let's say, that changed the playing field for everything and everyone. But that's not exactly true. Yes, the internet, I think, has has made it faster perhaps to be radicalized, or has extended the reach of certain messages way beyond how they were previously consumed. But it hasn't created terrorism. It hasn't created hatred. I mean, you look at, through history, the closest thing to the internet was a stone wall with inscriptions chiseled into them with a hammer.
Yep.
And we still had religious fanaticism and terrorist and violence, and we still had horrible messages by the Romans, and graffiti, early examples of graffiti and political violence.
Yep.
So, is the internet really the decisive factor?
No.
Or have we simply failed to resolve age-old problem of hatred amongst humans and religions?
It's the human condition. It's the human condition. It's always been the human condition, because we all choose, when we go on the internet, we choose what we go on. We choose how to react to something in life. Like, for example, going back to personal issues and child abuse, we choose how we react. We will react to them. There's two people can have similar or identical experiences in life. One becomes a murderer, the other becomes a saint. We make choices. We do make choices. So we make choices about what we access, and we make choices about, obviously, sometimes there will be people out there who will approach you and say, here is this, as I call it for terrorism, a highway to heaven. But I think you still make a choice. Nobody can be said to be completely gullible. That's why I tend not to overuse the term grooming in the terrorism sense, because I think it's common sense to know that killing people is wrong. There doesn't need to be a debate on that. But obviously, when someone does do that, then there has to be, in-depth analysis as to the whole process and why they did it. And like I've said before, ideology, there are some people out there who will believe it's 100% right because the Muslim is a Muslim and the Kafir is a Kafir.
Well, then let's talk a bit about choice in the modern era. You are a researcher on Islamic history, theology, and politics. Something I notice, we discuss sort of Christian violence and terrible events, but I always notice the fact that tend to be things that happened a long time ago. There seems to have been some kind of process that slowly made it less violent, which then begs onto, is there anything in Islamic practice, not just in theology, that condones or enables or validates making, the ultimate personal sacrifice, an ultimate cause?
No, it's a very valid question, and I think it needs to be asked, and I have approached scholars for years. We've just had the Rushdie incident, which I completely condemned, and it's on my pinned tweet. And we just seem to be going around in circles. We seem to be going around in circles, and as I've been tweeting, people are afraid to talk about Islam and the Quran and certain texts. And I say, as a Muslim, there are some things in history, and obviously we're going back 1,400 years, because I'm not going to deny that there are certain texts there that justify certain things. But for myself as a Muslim, I leave those things in that time and place. That's the way I phrase it. So for me, those things belong there in history. And there is a valid science, and I can debate with Muslims and non-Muslims. There's two valid sciences. One is called ijtihad. Ijtihad means to put things in a modern context. And then there's a deeper science. It's called Fiqh Al Aqaliyyah. Fiqh Al Aqaliyyah is once again goes on another level from ijtihad, where your Islam belongs the citizen, wherever you are a citizen, wherever you live, the time and the place, your Islam comes second place to your loyalty to your country. And it's a genuine science, and I can obviously send links. So we have Fiqh Al Aqaliyyah. So I can quite safely say as a Muslim that those things in history belong in history. And what the problem I have is with people denying history, as if to pretend that certain things didn't happen, or certain things weren't said, because they are there in print. And, when people point them out, people will say, well, yeah, okay, so they don't apply. And I do agree they don't apply. But the problem is, going back to Salafism now, or Takfir is more accurately, one of the reasons why people have used Salafism, the term, is because Salafis, they kind of claim to follow those first three generations, which we call the Prophet, Sahaba, and those who came after that. But you will find that even there's a lot of Salafis, outspoken Salafis, who speak out against the political Salafism, which is the Takfirism, really. So once again, it's very complex. It's very complex. But if some people choose to take everything literally, how do we stop them? This is why the onus is really to stop the problem from within the Muslim community.
Well, I wanted to speak more about that, Almin, now that you've mentioned it, because Sadiq, your brother-in-law, he was takfiri, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, with him, you couldn't tell, because, like I say, we have to differentiate between Salafi and takfiri. A Salafi can also be a Sufi in the sense, and as I know, even from a local mosque, they're all very Sufi, so it's a Sufi mindset. So a Salafi can just be someone who doesn't follow the four imams, but he follows kind of quite little teaching. So we can then go into like a conversation where you can be completely orthodox, you can be strict, you can follow Islam to the letter, and your life is not infringing on anybody else. So you're a peaceful Muslim. But what we have is a whole complication where sometimes strict Muslims or orthodox Muslims are seen as extremists. So this is why this conversation goes even deeper. So a Salafi can be a completely harmless person. Is the takfiri mindset? The takfiri mindset is the dangerous one, as we've seen with blasphemy. When someone says something and he's takfired upon, in other words, someone says, right, now you've lost your iman, now you can be a target for punishment or whatever. But then on my LinkedIn, my latest post is actually an imam mentioning that now the whole blasphemy thing, the takfir thing, is basically political and business, where you can just label someone because you want to destroy them. So in a way, it's a kind of cancel culture.
A witch hunt could be another word for it. Something that Christianity and Christian countries had as well. And it seems to me that from what you're describing, Arned, we have this multi-layered spider web. Sufis, Salafis, Takfiris, Barelvis on one hand, then the wider groups of Sunni and Shia, and then again divided by region and political affiliation, etc., etc. The Islamic world is not as united as it might seem on the outside. There are many fault lines within it, and of course there are victims who are not just people in Europe, but also Muslims themselves targeting each other. So it's a very complicated arena. Well, I agree with you that the internet is not the cause of it. It certainly doesn't help social media spaces and just how quick messages can be sent across. But regardless, turning back to this multidimensionality and the fault lines within Islam, you've worked many years in not only counterterrorism research, but in outreach towards other Muslim communities. Can you tell us a bit about your experience doing that outreach and what you saw as productive and that yielded tangible results when dealing with Muslim communities from a Muslim perspective? And for example, I know you've mentioned the importance of personal choice. So can you tell us a little bit about how that factors into the outreach work that you do? Well,
unfortunately, this is the problem that a lot of Muslim groups have with me in the UK, is when I have approached many, or practically all the main ones that we see online, there was a reluctance to discuss the subject. So in the beginning, I was very frustrated. In the first years, I was very frustrated, and this applies to imams and and the groups as well. And what I usually got was a whataboutery, and this is why they don't like me further. Or what about Iraq? What about Syria? What about Afghanistan? What about what they do? So I said, no, hang on. We have to deal with what some Muslims have chosen to do here. Right, so I got whataboutery. So I was very frustrated. Then I thought, hang on, why do they think like that? And then obviously I researched that psychology, the victimhood mindset, whataboutery. Why do they not actually, look at the problem, and rather they once again resort to this statistical thing, like, well, if you're going to compare London bombings, it's only so many. Over there is, thousands or millions, which I mentioned in the interview after the Manchester bombing. So then I thought, victimhood, hang on, these people, the Muslim has done something, but you're still kind of carrying the victimhood mentality. So I researched that, and then I kind of made this phrase called the Muslim victim industry. And then I researched that, then I researched Marxism and a few other political movements, and I put it all together. And then the first interview after the Manchester bombing, I used the term Muslim victim industry, where rather than dealing with the problem within our own community, they're always talking about problems abroad. So that added to my frustration. And then the other thing that I had to face was, and once again, some people that justify this, they call it like a siege mentality. They say, well, if you're going to talk about terrorism, Muslim terrorism, why are you calling it Muslim terrorism? You're labeling us all. I said, no, every intelligent person on the planet knows that when you're talking about Muslim terrorism, you're talking about Muslim terrorists. You're not talking about Islam and all Muslims. Yes, there are people who they will also use some of my work and what I have said and say, look, he's saying it's Muslim terrorism. Well, I'm saying, I'm just being specific because I'm differentiating between far-right terrorism or extremism and Muslim terrorism. And, there are different terminologies which are used like Islamism and that, which is a phrase that I kind of have disagreements with, which I do have to sometimes use. So, yeah, the reaction was kind of really more defensive. And unfortunately, then when we had ISIS, I think a lot of people then, they had nothing to say. They had to eat humble pie because the result of the inaction, the apathy, then came out with ISIS, with, I think thousands going from all over the world. So that was a result of apathy and in a way, a kind of denial as well.
Well, thank you for that, Ahmed. It's a pleasure to speak with you always. I see you as someone who is leading the way into strengthening the Muslim community here in Britain, to find their own answers, to get tough, to prevent further senseless violence from happening, and to find a way to really fixate on the problems that the youth might be facing, Muslim youth, and into finding a more productive outcome for their lives, and to heal those problems that we were mentioning earlier, that by lack of doing so would lead to far more violent outcomes. And so you are part of that solution, and for that I thank you. But we will speak more about Islamic history, tradition, moderate and radical Islam, and the grievances that you were just mentioning in further episodes, as this podcast today was an introduction into yourself, your life, your work, your outreach, and for our audience to get to know you a bit more personally. So thank you for that and for joining us here today, Ahmed.
Thank you for having me. I always appreciate anybody else also who gives me a platform. So thank you for having me.
Thank you again for coming, and I look forward to part 2, and I hope the listeners do too.
Thank you very much.
And I hope you'll stay with us for the next episodes that we've got planned. Please remember to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and more. And of course, to check out our website for the latest episodes. Thank you so much and have a great day.